we go. Hello, everyone. This is the Wellbeing Economics Podcast, the third episode now. And today I'm very pleased to have Professor Bill Mitchell. He's a professor of economics at the University of Newcastle in Australia, and he's one of the founding members of modern monetary theory. And he's also the author of the macroeconomics textbook, along with Randall Wray and Martin Watts. Pleased to have you, Bill. My name is Abdullah. I'll be the host for the podcast today. Thank you for coming on.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me from the other side of the world.
Yeah, it's always a bit harder to arrange that way, but that won't stop us. So today I wanted to talk to you about the rise of British monetarism and just British economic history generally in the post-war era. As the general idea that we have going around, if you ask your average person, is that we had a golden age, the golden post-Keynesian full employment age, but unfortunately that had to end because it's unsustainable. We got the long run Phillips curve trade-off, and therefore we cannot sustain that forever, and it led to stagflation and MMT and post-Keynesian economics. It has no response to stagflation. We cannot possibly explain it. What we needed was a good dose of monetarism to heal the economy. You know, Thatcher's medicine. It doesn't taste good, but it's what we need, and that supposedly saved us. And that's why this neoliberal Asia we have, there's no alternative. It had to happen. This post-war prosperity just wasn't sustainable. And I wanted to talk to you about how that is sort of a myth, and there's a lot of problems with that account of the story. And the blog post series that you were writing in 2016 was really interesting to me, because it really went against what we commonly find as like the acceptable story of how British economic history went down.
Yeah.
So I guess the best place to start would be perhaps you could explain the beginnings of that era. So what was this golden age of capitalism in Britain? And under roughly what time did it exist? Which prime ministers were responsible for what policies? What was this era before the crises started?
Well, you know, all of the advanced countries after the end of the Second World War were faced with a challenge, because what they had learned during so go back to the 1930s, to the Great Depression era. And this was a real battle among economists as to how to proceed. And of course, the dominant British Treasury view was to apply sort of neoclassical thinking and cut wages, to engineer a real wage cut, which they said would, through marginal productivity theory, would increase employment. And that was initially done in the early 1930s, and it failed. Things got worse. And so there was a huge debate during the 1930s in all of our nations in various ways about, well, how are we all going to get out of this massive depression? And it really wasn't until the onset of the Second World War, with the escalation of military spending, that the Great Depression ended. It was really the military spending and the massive deficits that nations ran up to prosecute the war effort that ended the Great Depression. And so once the peace was established in 1945, the challenge then was, well, how do you... So what we learned out of that exercise was that the very Keynesian type, and I'm using the Keynesian as in Keynes, even though Keynes himself said he wasn't a Keynesian. But what economists learnt from that exercise was that government can, if they choose, to establish full employment conditions through manipulation of aggregate spending, through appropriate settings of government spending and taxation, and typically having to run a fiscal deficit. And so then the challenge in 1945 was, how are you going to do that when we weren't bombing the hell out of each other? So the question of the piece was, how are we going to maintain that full employment and that exercise that government responsibility and capacity without the massive spending on military procurements. And so at that time, most of the advanced nations published in various, according to their own institutional procedures, but published what the British and the Australians called white papers. So major mission statements from the national, or in our case, Australian case, federal government, but the national government. And this set out the commitment to the post-war period to regain prosperity after the carnage of the Second World War. The Marshall Plan in Europe was sort of consistent with that. The reconstruction of Japan was consistent with that. And once things settled down after the conflict, governments understood clearly that they were responsible for maintaining total spending that was sufficient to employ everybody that wanted to work, and that they could do that through in a range of ways, including major nation building activities, public infrastructure, public health, public education, public transport, public utilities, and all of the things that became important in building our nations after the war. And they could also do it by maintaining welfare safety nets. So even though the concept of a welfare state had emerged prior to the Second World War, prior to the First World War, in fact, but it really became institutionalised in our nations, a system of income support and protection. So that's the sort of context that we head into. Now, the other thing that they did, which was almost counterproductive to that first commitment, was to set exchange rates fixed under the Bretton Woods system. So this was like a quasi-gold standard where the nations, all of our exchange rates, our currencies were set at agreed parities against the US dollar, and the US dollar was then set at a value according to the value of gold. Now, at the time, there hadn't been any new gold discoveries for a long time, and so it was thought that the gold price would be relatively stable and become a sort of good, stable benchmark for then fixing all of the other currencies. And so we entered the Bretton Woods period of fixed exchange rates from 1946. Now, the problem with that system, it was doomed from the start because the structure of our economies was so different. And for Britain, for example, it faced continual external deficits on the current account, the trade account, and other nations, most nations were in that position. There were some very strong nations like Germany, because Germany, of course, sought to establish some national pride after being a pariah after the Second World War in the global context. Germany had had no repute at all after what it had been up to. And so it sought to establish some national pride by economic strength and trade strength, and of course that continues through to today mostly. And so it used to run big surpluses on the exchange, on the external account, whereas most other countries, but particularly Britain and Italy and France and Australia, ran external deficits. Now, the problem under the Bretton Woods system, and we probably haven't got time to go into it, but the problem was that the central banks at the time were responsible under that system for managing their currencies within the agreed fluctuation bands. And so for a country with an external deficit, it was always supplying more of its currency into the foreign exchange markets than were being demanded by other countries. And so they were always facing downward pressure on their exchange rate. Now, the only way the central bank could deal with that situation was to buy its own currency up in the foreign exchange markets by using its stocks of foreign exchange that they held, and also by putting up interest rates to attract capital inflow on the capital account to bolster the strength of the currency. And at the same time, the treasuries, the finance ministries who ran fiscal policy, had to be careful not to be too cavalier in their deficit spending, because otherwise that would lead to higher imports and exchange rate instability through the trade account. Now, that system was unsustainable because countries running persistent external deficits were always really pushing their domestic economies towards recession through buying up their own currency and taking it out of the system and pushing up interest rates. And so that became politically unsustainable. And so what you started to see in the 1960s was a system of what became known as competitive devaluations. And so under the Bretton Woods system, countries could approach the IMF that sort of ran the show and provided the lending of the last resort to countries of foreign exchange when they ran out of foreign exchange, which was necessary to defend their exchange rates if there was downward pressure. Countries started to approach the IMF and said, look, we can't possibly continue. There's too much political instability with the higher unemployment, etc., of defending the current parity. So can we devalue our currency? And under the exchange rate system, that was allowed. The IMF would approve that, blah, blah. And the problem was, though, that then countries started to see that strategy as a competitive strategy, because they could leapfrog. One country would seek to devalue, and then the other countries would then seek to devalue it by more, and to get a competitive advantage in terms of their real exchange rate, and in other words, trade advantage. And by the 1960s, that became unsustainable. And the other problem, of course, was that the country, because of the dominance of the US dollar in this system, as a means of trade, setting trade contracts, etc., countries were accumulating US dollars in great quantities. And then, of course, the US decided to prosecute the Vietnam War, an imperialist war from the American perspective, as part of their deep paranoia about the spread of communism. And that required massive domestic spending in the US to run the war effort, and that flooded that caused the US to increasingly go into deficit externally and be pumping US dollars into the world economy. And of course, at this point, exchange instability became very very pronounced, and countries that were holding large pools of US dollars started to worry that their value of the US dollar would plummet, because there was, they started to worry there was too much of it, much dollars in the system. And so the French in particular and other countries then demanded under the system that the US dollar the US government start converting US dollars into gold stocks, which was the logic of the system. And the French in particular demanded these huge shipments of gold. And by the end of the 60s, it became apparent that the US government would, deplete its gold reserves, and the system became unsustainable. Now, at that point, the inflationary pressures started to increase, and the orthodoxy, the full employment orthodoxy, hadn't really considered a system where you had a problem with inflation coming from the supply side. Now, the other thing that is part of this jigsaw is the 1973 decision by OPEC to form and then push up oil prices. Now, that created havoc in the world economy, because the oil-dependent economies suddenly had a huge imported raw material cost shock, and then there was an unholy war between labour and capital in the countries as to who was going to take the real income loss from that. So you put all those factors together, and by the late 60s, early 70s, the post-war consensus was breaking down. Now, the monetarists like Milton Friedman, etc., they hated the full employment system back in the 50s. They were arguing against that because they wanted free markets, what they alleged would be free markets. And so they were already writing and carrying on about the Keynesian era and how it would lead to, inflation, and trade unions would get too powerful because there was full employment. And so, you had the famous article by Friedman in 1968, his presidential address to the American Economic Association, where he outlined these ideas. And then you had the OPEC oil crisis, which appeared to to validate his view. So you had this unemployment starting to, was low at that stage, and you had inflation rising quite rapidly. Now, the Keynesians didn't know what to do because they hadn't ever experienced a situation where they hadn't really understood in their framework that the inflation came from the supply side. Now, interestingly, in the 60s, the Marxists, particularly the American and British Marxists, they predicted that, they developed this notion of conflict theory of inflation, that inflation was ultimately the result of a fight over real income shares, and that if workers had some wage-setting influence through strike activity, etc., and capital had price-setting power through increasing concentration of industry, monopoly, and etc., then there would be a wage-price battle if there were raw material shocks coming from the imports. And so, but the Keynesians were lost. They thought inflation would come from excessive demand, not from a supply problem. So the OPEC oil price shock really gave credence to Milton Friedman's ideas, and but they were already growing in importance before the OPEC shock, and because the Academy was, especially after the 1968 article by Friedman and then a related article by Edmund Phelps, which said, developed all this theory at the time. The Academy started to turn at that point, and the new graduates started to infiltrate central banks. So what you saw, say, in Britain, the first monetarist experiment was the credit and competition policy in the early 70s under Edward Heath, who was a Tory Prime Minister. And so this was the Bank of England attempted to apply chapter and verse the monetary targeting rules set out by Friedman. So this said that if you that inflation was an excessive money supply issue, and that if you wanted to control inflation, then you had to control the money supply growth, and so the central bank had to target the quantity of money in the system. Now this came straight from the standard textbook models that the central bank controlled the money supply. Totally at odds with the reality, but that was the theory, that that high-powered money was controlled by the central bank, and through the money multiplier that would impose discipline on the money supply. So the Bank of England put in monetary targets in 1971, 72, and a couple of years later they abandoned them because it didn't work. And at that point, this was before the second Harold Wilson Labor government had been elected, as a result of the failure of that Heath government in the early 70s, and as a result of the rising unemployment and the emergence of stagflation. And but if you think about it in historical terms, the monetarism should have been dead at that stage, because the central tenet of monetarism was that the central bank could set monetary targets and manipulate the high-powered money to through the money multiplier achieve those targets more or less, and that was the central idea of Milton Friedman. Now, the fact that there was an attempt to try that by the Bank of England, that was the first attempt. It failed dramatically. They abandoned it. That should have been the end of the story. But the problem was that OPEC then came along with the inflationary episode, and the Keynesians didn't know how to respond to that. Now, at that time in Britain, Heath got chucked out, the Tory government got thrown out, and Harold Wilson became Prime Minister, and Dennis Healey became the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the Treasurer. And there was an almighty battle within the British Labour Party because you had Tony Benn's group of socialists, and they wanted to address the inflationary pressures coming from the OPEC cost shock. They wanted to address them through incomes policies and more planning, more national infrastructure investment, and regulation on corporate monopolies and things like that, which was the sort of standard socialist approach within the British Labour Party at the time. But the problem was that Dennis Healey, who was the Chancellor, he became totally besotted by Friedman's monetarism. And he convinced a powerful group within the British Labour Party, which by then was in government, to also adopt that sort of approach, and there was a huge battle within the Labor Party between that group and the Tony Benn socialist group. Now, because Dennis Healy was the Chancellor, and of course then James Callaghan undermined Harold Wilson and got rid of him as Prime Minister, and James Callaghan fell into, as British Prime Minister, Labor fell into the Dennis Healy camp. And so by 1974, 1975, the leadership of the British Labor Party was doing everything they could to undermine socialists within the party and demote them in the ministry and humiliate them in public statements. And so then you had then the monetarist Labor Party ministers, Healy and Callaghan and co. They had to deal with the problem of the British trade union movement, because they had a social pact, and the British trade union movement hadn't adopted monetarism. So Healy as the Chancellor, the Treasurer, had to work out how he could get around the industrial power of the trade union movement in Britain, which by then was considerable, particularly the so-called Triple Alliance, the big steel, transport and mining unions, which basically could create havoc anytime they wanted to. And so he had to come up with a strategy to deal with the unions, but and by then monetarism had become a full-scale attack on fiscal deficits by them. You know, it had sort of morphed beyond this monetary targeting era of the early 70s into just a full-scale attack on government use of fiscal policy. And so we had all of the debate about rules versus discretion, and all of the arguments about the lags in fiscal policy, and that whole era of literature emerged in the academy that fiscal policy was unsustainable and we had to go to a set of fiscal rules. And so that, you know, the obsession with fiscal rules now dates back to that era. And so Healy, as the Treasurer, the Chancellor, was trying to work out, well, how could he impose fiscal, what we now call neoliberalism, how could he impose austerity without breaching or being seen to go back on his word with the trade unions? So they invented a ruse, and this was what I call the first act of depoliticisation in economic policy making. And depoliticisation is now very common, and it's where the elected government, who typically is responsible for government policy and accountable to the people via the voters, they depoliticise the economic policy making by appealing to an external party. And so Healy came up with the idea that the IMF was that Britain had run out of money, and that they would have to borrow from the IMF, and by then the IMF was was reinventing itself. With the collapse of fixed exchange rates, the IMF really had no role to play, because its role was defined under the fixed exchange rate system. So when the fixed exchange rate system basically collapsed in 1971, the IMF reinvented itself as sort of a neoliberal attack dog. And so it became a country that would lend governments foreign exchange who were running short of foreign exchange, but in return they started to impose quite harsh conditionalities on those governments. So the type of conditionalities we see now, you know, cutting government spending, cutting welfare spending, cutting pensions, cutting wages, privatisation, all of those so-called conditionalities had already now emerged in the 1970s. And so Healy and Callaghan went to the British people and claimed, look, there is no alternative. Tina, we're running out of money. We've got to borrow from the IMF. And the IMF will only lend us money to keep our country solvent if we do this, this and this, which they could then turn around to the trade union bosses and say, look, it's not us doing this, we're being forced to do this. So, you know, that led to the famous statement by James Callaghan at the Blackpool Annual Labour Conference in September 1975, that the era of Keynesianism was over, that the idea that governments could simply run deficits and maintain full employment was now unsustainable, and that the challenge of governments now was to run so-called responsible, in inverted commas, fiscal policy to make sure we meet our inflation targets. And at that point, the British Labour Party and government became the first monetarist government. So Thatcher was not the first monetarist government, it was the British Labour government.
Yeah, that's a point I found really interesting in your blog. It's what goes against the grain of conventional understanding of British economic history, because what people tend to say is that right until James Callaghan, Britain, under all the prime ministers, has been thoroughly Keynesian. Wilson and Callaghan, they just spent like drunken sailors out of control. But that's not really true, because if you actually look at the budgets, it tells quite a different story. And I wanna back up a bit first, because we just had a very comprehensive overview. So I want to talk about the exchange rate regime that you did mention earlier, and what we tend to call it was a stop-go economics, where when the previous governments, when they heated up the economy to reduce unemployment, the larger deficits and then larger incomes for people, and they spent that on imports, and that obviously had adverse effects on the exchange rate. And since it was pegged, they had to deflate the economy again in order to remain competitive and export to keep the exchange rate up. And that kind of, I think, hampered even the golden age of Keynesianism. It could have been even better, I think, if they didn't have that system. But it really started to, I think, become a huge issue, I think, in the first Wilson government, because we had two pretty right-wing chancellors. I think the first one, Jim Callaghan, and then Roy Jenkins. Their primary mission was to support that exchange rate peg, and by doing so, they implemented austerity measures, essentially, especially Roy Jenkins, and a lot of money towards council homes and roads. It was all like cut. I guess we wouldn't call that one monetarist, because it was motivated more by the Bretton Woods system. But I think when people talk of stagflation, the stag part of that, I would say, came as a result of said policies in the late 60s. Would you agree with that?
Look, to some extent, it was quite clear that all of the nations were experiencing the stop-go phenomenon. But the reason for that, yeah, I mean, the mechanisms were because under the exchange rate system, macroeconomic policy, monetary and fiscal policy, had to be was constrained by the external parity constraint, and that so ultimately constrained when they had to compromise domestic policy for the external agreement. But having said that, I mean, the full employment mission was very powerful in all those governments, And the fact that you had stop-go was because of that powerful mission, that they always wanted to push for full employment. And occasionally that created problems on the external account, which then under the fixed exchange rate system compromised them, and they had to then cut back. So that's not a monetarist sort of dynamic at all, because they believed very firmly that in the role of fiscal policy, and their challenge, there were in the ministries, there were, a really popular job for graduates in econometrics would be to go into the labour and finance and treasury ministries and work on forecasts and the big models that were trying to refine the balance between the net spending of the governments and the supply side of the economy. And so, regularly they overheated their economies in the sense of pushing imports up too quickly. And of course, that in that era there was a lot of policy development in import competing investment to minimise that problem, and countries governments would invest in export promotion and subsidise export industries. So they understood that the external account was a problem under fixed exchange rates, but the mission was to have full employment, and occasionally that came unstuck. But the unemployment really didn't emerge until the 70s, and it really didn't emerge in any significant way until the OPEC era. There were glitches, and see, remember, the other thing to note when I say that is that the population's sensitivity to unemployment was very high in those days. So, for example, in Australia, the Conservative government in 1961 nearly lost government because unemployment went from 1.9% to 2.1%. And so the people were really sensitive to very small changes in unemployment. And like long-term unemployment was defined as 12 weeks, not a year, and which we do now. And so the sensitivity to unemployment was very high then. And so when we talk about political instability coming to external deficit countries, it was because of very small changes in unemployment caused political havoc of the type that wouldn't be seen now, given we've been sort of desensitised to unemployment.
Yeah, I mean, the social consequences of unemployment, I would say, far exceed inflation. For every percentage increase in unemployment, I think that the results are devastating compared to 1% inflation increase. Nonetheless, nowadays, inflation is always seen as the main boogeyman. And I guess the common argument is we shouldn't blame the OPEC oil shock because inflation started creeping up in the late 60s. So what do you think is the explanation for the inflation that we saw in the late 60s, as opposed to the obvious commodity price shock that we saw in the 70s?
Yeah, well, it was mainly the American government spending on Vietnam War. That caused American inflation to rise in the late 60s and early 70s. And there was also huge debates about trade union power at that time in all of our countries. Every week on TV there'd be a discussion on the current affairs programs about trade union power, and what we know by the late 60s, the distribution of income had become much fairer, and I'm talking between wages and profits. And income inequality was significantly reducing, and the standards of living of workers were rising, considerably. And this was a time, of course, when we had much stronger growth in productivity than we've got now, and stronger GDP growth than we've got now. But what happened in that era was that business interests were starting to resent the increased equity in our systems. And so you had that in 1971, you had the famous manifesto in America called the Powell Manifesto. And this was written by Lewis Powell, who was an attorney, a solicitor, who later became, a few weeks after he published that, President Nixon appointed him to the Supreme Court as a judge, and he was one of the most conservative Supreme Court judges in American history. But the Powell Manifesto, and it's publicly available, it's an unbelievably organised document that outlines a strategy where the business sector, capital, would fight back against labour and reverse the balance of power that had been created during the full employment period. So, and Powell recommended that capital take over media organisations. So you started to get the sort of things like Fox News and Sky News, and invest heavily in think tanks. So all of these think tanks that pump out all of this right-wing free market dogma, they emerged in this period. Powell recommended that the capital invest in public education systems and start to influence the curriculum. And so you started to get this period where endowed chairs and that were created within universities and by business, and you started to get the attack on humanities and the so-called left-wing social sciences. And so, yeah, I mean, capital was getting organised in the late 60s, early 70s before OPEC, but OPEC really gave them it was such a large crisis for oil-dependent countries that it really created the havoc that allowed them to create the paradigm shift that they were working on.
Yeah, the Powell Memorandum is fascinating in how much it shows like the class consciousness of the business class. In some ways, it's actually inspiring. I wish the working class could channel some of that energy towards themselves. And yeah, as we saw, there was a lot of like Heritage Foundation in America and American Enterprise Institute. All of these think tanks started rising, and in Britain we got the Centre for Policy Studies, and well, I think they came a little bit later. And also, like in terms of the media, I think the Daily Herald was like a working class newspaper, and then unfortunately it morphed into the Sun. So there was this general push towards this monetarist ideology during that time.
It was very organised, though, and it didn't just come out of sort of a superior knowledge system. It was an ideological warfare. And the things that capital have going for them is that they've got money, and they can accept a common ideology, that is profit and greed and power. Whereas on the left, the progressive side of the debate has little money and continually fragments into internecine warfare. I mean, all in the 1970s, as capital was highly organised, creating these propaganda machines, think tanks, and buying up, infiltrating the media and the press, etc. What was the progressive side of politics? fighting identity wars and gender wars and all of the things that are not unimportant, but effectively the left in the social democratic political movement abandoned the main game to the conservatives, and we lost dramatically.
Yeah, the economic debate was sort of conceded, and all they had left was the social end. And I think it's no surprise that like postmodernism and various other critical theory type of approaches started rising up in the 70s because the class dynamic was just left to the wayside. They didn't have an answer for it.
Yeah, even the European Marxists became obsessed with postmodernist and deconstructions and all of that. And one of the most hilarious stories I could tell is that the CIA basically worked out that they could, that the left was so pathetic that they could make it even more pathetic by promoting French Marxist intellectuals. Do you know that story? So, do you know that story?
I don't know about the CIA, but that's news to me.
The CIA started to organise workshops and conferences with French and continental Marxists, and because they knew that would just turn everybody off, all that deconstruction and postmodernism, and at the same time, as you said, the left or the progressives started to believe in the monetarist macroeconomics. And so you had the famous book by James O'Connor, a Marxist, in 1973, The Fiscal Crisis of the State, where he conceded that the state would run out of money and couldn't possibly continue to maintain the welfare state and what have you. And so by then that was game over. They'd conceded the main game and gone off and into these battles about critical realism and all the rest of the stuff, and of hermeneutics and methodological debates. And I mean, I can remember a young postgraduate student going to conferences in the sort of late 70s when monetarism was raging, where the whole heterodox or progressive conferences were obsessed with hermeneutics. I mean, for God's sake.
Yeah, I mean, to this day, is still the dominant force in universities. Because curiously, at university here, because I do a double major, economics and international relations, the international relations side is mostly dominated by leftists generally, both Marxist and non-Marxist ones. And there it's all about critical theory, hermeneutics, and all the supposedly left-wing stuff. And then in the economics department, it's, well, the monetary consensus.
Mainstream New Keynesianism.
New Keynesianism, yes. So for some reason, the left has taken over every other social science field, but economics was just sort of left there, like out of fear almost, like they had nothing to say to it, and then they just kept focusing on sociology and everything else, and philosophy, whilst completely leaving the economic side and the real world side to the wayside.
Well, one of the reasons was, of course, that at that era, economics became highly mathematized, and the progressive economists had typically not been well trained in mathematics. Some were, but others, most weren't. And I think to my graduate era, my graduate school, almost everybody were poor mathematicians. I was a funny exception because I'd done maths in my studies, and I was an econometrician, so I was good at mathematical stats. But most of my class were very weak so they had no tools to fight back with, and so the mainstream completely created this mathematical smokescreen. Now, if you come from mathematics as I did, you know that the mathematics that economists use is pretty low quality maths. But for the average economic student, it looked like just a unfathomable smokescreen. And so, the economists hid behind that smokescreen and claimed authority, whereas it was just really nonsense.
Especially compared to the maths of physics and
Yeah.
dynamic analysis rather than the statics that we do. So in regards to, so obviously the left didn't have a response, but curiously the dominant paradigm at the time, the neoclassical synthesis Keynesians, also did not have a response. They just saw it in terms of demand pull inflation. They didn't really have an answer to this cost side phenomenon. And so I wanted to ask you about that. So Samuelson's synthesis, why was it so ill-equipped to deal with the OPEC oil shock and the cost push, wage price spiral type of inflation of the late 60s?
Well, because they didn't have an inherent theory of class conflict. The Marxists in the 1960s had, because their fundamental starting point for their analytical framework is class conflict. That you have to start to understand capitalist dynamics, you have to understand it from the lens of class conflict. So if you start from that, then the sort of questions you'll ask become apparent. So if you have a raw material supply shock, it's quite clear that there's going to be a fight out between the battle of the markups, it's been called, a fight between unions and worker representatives and bosses, the price setters. You're going to have a fight as to who has to take that real income loss when your economy has less real income overall because the imports have risen in price. So the Marxists could easily understand that distributional struggle because they understood it in terms of class conflict, whereas the neoclassical synthesis, the Keynesians, they couldn't really grasp that initially because they didn't have an inherent theory of class conflict. And so they were slow to respond to that, but, they just got completely wedged by the growing interest in monetarism. And
I mean, Samuelson had his neoclassical microeconomics, and he tried to somehow reconcile that with supposedly Keynesian macroeconomics. And I would imagine that would make you pretty inequipped to deal with, especially if you don't have a cost plus markup approach to price and wage setting. So then the monetarist sort of counter revolution took place, and the form it initially took was trying to control monetary aggregates. And I think you mentioned the CCC policy that the Bank of England was getting at, and even later under Thatcher, her chancellors abandoned. I think it was M2 targets. I forgot the exact type of monetary aggregate, but it was something like a failed experiment, completely and utterly. Even Volcker in America abandoned it. So why didn't monetarism die when that happened?
Well, because it was a paradigm by then. The senior professors in the academy had taken over, and they were monetarists, and their graduate students were pumping out monetarists. In my graduate year, almost all of the students who came out were monetarists. Very few were like me, and the problem then was that, like all paradigms, they exert control over the appointments processes into the junior ranks of the academy. So it's really hard to get a job if you're not in line with the senior professors. And then they control promotion, they control access to research grants, and they control the academic journals which help you get promoted. And so in effect, the paradigm becomes self-reinforcing through the power exercised by the senior practitioners. And I've written a lot in the last 10 years about this concept called groupthink. And groupthink is how groups become patterned in their behaviour. In the early 70s, a philosophy of science person, Imre Lakatos, wrote about degenerative paradigms. And these are paradigms that schools of thought in academic life. These are paradigms that are degenerative in the sense that their body of knowledge or their ideas and their conjectures effectively lose empirical veracity. In other words, they don't explain anything. And but he said that degenerative paradigms can hang on through groupthink, and they use those power controls within the academy, within the group, and you know, this is a pattern of a lot of academic disciplines, not just economics. And Max Planck, the German physicist, said that paradigms die one funeral at a time. And what he didn't actually say that, by the way, but that's sort of that's the attribution that his longer quote comes down to. But what he meant was that, you know, you're not going to get much shift in a paradigm because until the senior professors retire or die, because they don't want to admit that for 40 years they've been wrong as new knowledge comes in or their ideas become undermined. And the junior staff under them don't want to contradict the senior professors because they know they've got a skin in the game, that their promotion and publication and research grant prospects are dependent upon being basically yes men and women. So that sort of group mentality starts to become like a mob rule. And it becomes to the point where they actually deny reality. And I remember when I was in my final year of undergraduate, the professor that was teaching us at the time said, class, and I'm just paraphrasing, when there's a problem between the theory and the facts that you observe, the facts are wrong. And that's groupthink. And so to answer your question, you know, mainstream economics from monetarism through to its latest incarnation is a degenerative paradigm, but it hangs on because of its control of the institutional mechanisms and the inputs to the academy, and it's you know, even go back to the 19th century. How did marginal theory, neoclassical theory, develop? Well, it developed in the sort of second half of the 1800s, and with massive funding from large industrialists, because they were scared to death, because Marxism was growing in importance among the working class. You know, you had the 1848 revolutions, the 1871 Paris Commune, and capital was the early industrialists were living in fear that there was going to be a Marxist overthrow. So they had to work out a body of theory that countered surplus value theory, which established that workers were being dealt a bad situation. They were getting unpaid work stolen off them by the ownership relations under capitalism. Well, the industrialists funded the academy to come up with a theory of distribution that looked like it was fair. And what did we come up with? Marginal productivity theory, where everybody gets back what they put in. How fair is that? Very fair. And so, you know, all of the phases of capitalism have been marked by capital trying to infiltrate the academies and to the academy playing ball to capital. And, you know, you just had to, there was a film that came out just around the global financial crisis called The Inside Job. Did you see that?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, here's all these senior professors in the mainstream economics academy doing the ideological work of capital and holding it out to be scientific knowledge when it was nothing of the sort. And so that's the reason why these ideas persist, even though they're degenerative and they've failed dramatically when applied.
So how do we address the big elephant in the room then? I think the core idea of Friedman that survived to the latest incarnations of Lucas' critique in classical economics is this notion of long-run neutrality of money. How do we counter that argument? In the long run, workers won't get fooled anymore by fiscal intervention. What's wrong with this idea?
Well, the bosses don't believe that, do they? Who had their hands out when the global financial crisis emerged, and who had their hands out when the pandemic emerged in 2020? We've had, for the average citizen, we've had two dramatic episodes in the last 13 years, that demonstrate the power of fiscal policy. Two dramatic events in human history, really. And the problem is that until the senior professors die off and younger professors come in that have got different ideas, these ideas are going to persist because they've infiltrated the policy settings, they've infiltrated the policy-making departments in our bureaucracies, and it's a hard road back.
Some say there's a lot of problems, perhaps, on the way the left has formulated its arguments after the Great Depression. Like, for instance, Keynes conceded as much as he possibly could to neoclassicals whilst only sticking to key points like marginal productivity theory, perfect competition. Do you think that there should have been a more militant pushback against the foundations of neoclassical economics, and the fact that we just focused on some macro aspects allowed them to finally rear their heads again?
Yeah, well, I mean, they reared their heads very quickly. I mean, with J.R. Hicks and his book Value and Capital, and which laid out the ISLM neoclassical synthesis. And there was, at the time Keynes was formulating these ideas, he was having huge debates with Roy Harrod at Cambridge, for example, about whether he should use marginal productivity demand side and in the general theory, for example. And Keynes's sort of argument was, if you're in Spain, you should speak Spanish if you want to be heard. So if you want to have a dialogue with the British Treasury view at the time, the Pagovian sort of consensus, then you had to have a minimal departure from their belief system. Whereas Michael Koleski, for example, and of course there's a debate in the literature as to whether Keynes just stole Koleski's work, and I'm on the side that says he did. And Koleski, of course, couldn't get published in the British by Macmillan or anyone because he was a Polish Marxist, and he did menial jobs around Cambridge at the time. But there's no doubt Keynes spoke at length with him, and in the literature that we now know Koleski wrote, he had a much richer formulation of the dynamics that underpinned the general theory. So if we had have pursued Koleskian economics, the neoclassical synthesis couldn't have emerged, because he had a price markup models and all of the degree of monopoly and all the rest of it. So Yeah, I mean, Keynes opened the door for the mainstream to just push him out to be a special case, as they called it. And, the game continued. And so, yeah, I think the way in which John Maynard Keynes constructed his general theory with minimal departure from the mainstream of the time allowed them to hijack the debate again and purport or portray Keynes's work as this special case where wages were rigid and eliminate all of the stuff of dynamic, endemic uncertainty and all of the other stuff that was really central to Keynes. That just got completely lost. And so, if that hadn't got lost, we would have never got rational expectations and all of the rest of the nonsense that formulated this body of work after the 1970s.
Unfortunately, he just got reduced to the sticky wages idea, and sometimes I wonder, because when he laid out his argument in a general theory, the arguments he made were a bit not the strongest in my view, because there were a lot of appeals to, you can't really change the real wage because prices might go up, or workers care about relative wages rather than real wages and stuff. I think Callaghan did make better arguments in that regard with his profit equations. And
he was a Marxist and he understood class conflict. And it's interesting. I mean, I know you've interviewed my colleague Randy Ray in a previous edition. Well, Randy thinks the general theory is wonderful. I think it's one of the worst books that I've read in economic literature.
Really?
And I do. I was much more influenced by Callaghan, whereas Randy was much more influenced by Keynes.
Yeah, that's quite interesting. All right, so skipping forward again. So this new paradigm has established itself, monetarism and its new classical forms and whatnot. One of the key aspects here was this shift from fiscal to monetary policy. And, well, they gave up on targeting money supply, so they targeted the interest rate. And this became the new macroeconomic stabilization tool. What's wrong with this approach to economics? Why is monetary policy less ideal or even valid at all compared to fiscal policy?
Well, almost everything's wrong with it. To put a finer point on it, I mean, this was the so-called debate about the assignment of policy tools. Which of the policy tools are you going to prioritise in your assignment? That's the way new Keynesians talk. And the big debate in the 1970s was, in the 1960s with the dominance of the ISLM model, the synthesis type approach to macro, we had all these discussions about crowding out, about possibilities of insolvency through bond market, excessive risk in as seen by bond markets of insolvency and all of that stuff. And in the 1970s, that literature morphed into, and I mentioned it before, morphed into this debate about rules versus discretion. And Friedman and his mob claimed that fiscal policy would be destabilising, not counter-stabilising, because let's suppose you have a downturn in private spending. A Keynesian would say, let's increase public net spending to fill the gap temporarily while pessimism reigns in the private sector. And of course, Friedman claimed that, Well, the problem with that sort of approach was that by the time governments worked out how much spending they needed to put in, and they'd have to work out where to put it, and they'd have to design interventions, and by the time they got round to all of that and actually started spending money, the private sector would have recovered and the government spending would just overheat the economy. And so really it was an attack on discretionary fiscal policy. And so, and coupled with the belief that monetary policy should be exclusively assigned to dealing with price stability, then you had that shift in the dominance of monetary policy emerged. Now, what's wrong with it? And this was reinforced in the 1990s by all of this depoliticised raving about the independence of central banks. Now, anyone who knows anything about the way the monetary system works knows that the central banks can't possibly be independent on a functional basis. They're intrinsically linked on a daily basis with the treasury function, because to manage the volume of cash in the economy, to meet interest rate targets, fiscal policy influences the state of the cash market each day. And so they have to coordinate, and central banks and treasuries have daily meetings to coordinate their actions. They can't be independent. But it became the political mantra, didn't it, that they were independent. Now, the problem, of course, is that even the central bankers are unclear on the distributional effects of interest rate changes, because there's winners and losers. There's creditors are winning and debtors lose. Now, they don't know what the net effect of that's going to be, nor they don't know what the temporal effects are going to be, what the lags are going to be. And so in the short run, you're very likely to get the winners increasing their spending because of the income effects on their financial assets of the interest rate rises, for example. And the losers are likely to attempt to resist the squeeze on their disposable income from the interest rate rises, particularly I'm talking about the debtors here, by running down savings or other techniques. And so you're likely to, in the short run, an interest rate rise may well be even expansionary, not contractionary. And moreover, it's highly likely that interest rate rises are inflationary themselves, because they force up business costs. Any business with a mortgage, with an overdraft, is immediately beset with higher costs, and if they've got market power, they pass them on. And moreover, they affect the mortgages of rentiers, landlords, who in a tight labour housing market can push up rents, and rents are a significant component of our CPI indexes. And so it's quite likely that interest rate rises are inflationary, at least in the short run. And it's only really when you start driving low-income mortgage holders into insolvency that you may well reverse that a bit and start pushing the economy towards recession. And the other thing is that the central bankers, it's very, it's called a blunt instrument, isn't it? It's unclear what the lags are. So, for example, at the moment, are the interest rate rises that the Australian central bank has been pushing up having the effect that they think? Well, a lot of mortgages early in the pandemic were put on fixed rates. Now they're about to become variable rates because the fixed rate contracts are running out. They've got no idea. They've had 11 interest rate rises. They don't have an idea of what the impact of that's going to be. So it's very indirect. There's a lot of adjustments that affected parties can make to stifle the effects, at least in the short run. And at the moment, for example, the Reserve Bank of Australia, with its interest rate push, is creating one of the largest redistributions of income in our history from poor to rich, because it's the low-income mortgage holders that are getting hit, and it's the high-income, wealthy asset holders that are making huge gains. So I think on all of those grounds, the lags, the uncertainty, the distributional impacts, monetary policy is a very poor instrument, and it's a very uncertain instrument. Whereas fiscal policy, we know when the government spends $1 or £1 into the economy, that's $1 that goes into increased sales typically, or if households are extremely indebted, into increased savings and reduction of household debt. And so whichever way you look at it, though, their direct effects, they're relatively certain, they're relatively able to be forecasted with much higher certainty than the impacts of monetary policy. And moreover, the fiscal policy is accountable to us through the ballot box, whereas the monetary policy, through depoliticisation, the monetary policy committees are unaccountable. We can't deal with them. If they stuff up, we can't do anything about it. Whereas if the government stuffs up fiscal policy, we vote them out. That's simple as that. So for all of those reasons, the directness, the more increased certainty, the ability to, and another reason I didn't mention, and that is the fiscal policy can be very targeted, both spatially in regions, but also in demographic cohort. So think about the response of the Japanese system at the moment. They've had the same imported cost pressures as all of us as a result of the supply constraints from the pandemic and the war in Ukraine and OPEC. But the central Bank of Japan hasn't raised interest rates at all. And the fiscal authority, the Ministry of Finance, has expanded fiscal policy by providing subsidies to low-income households to ease them through the cost of living shock, and give subsidies to business as part of a deal not to pass on the import prices, in other words, to squeeze their margins and accept the subsidy in return. Now, what's happening? Well, their inflation's dropping faster than anyone else. They're not heading towards recession. They haven't had the massive distributional shift from poor to rich that are happening in all of our other countries. And so we're having this dramatic experiment now, and the Japanese are winning and the rest of the countries are losing. And that tells you the power of fiscal policy and the ineffectiveness of monetary policy.
One of the very popular arguments right now is the situation in Turkey with Erdogan refusing to raise rates. What people argue is that since the inflation is caused by the FX side, the exchange rate side, if you raise rates to attract capital inflows, and that would ease the inflation by boosting the exchange rate. And correct me if I'm wrong, the late 60s inflation of the Vietnam War was because the British pound was pegged to the US dollar. So when you have an exchange rate induced inflation situation, what do you say is the counter argument there to using monetary policy?
Yeah, well, I mean, if you've got pegged exchange rates, you import inflation. That's it. It's straightforward. I mean, the Turkish situation is really complicated, and I'm not an expert on Turkey, but it's not what the mainstream think. And the point I'd make is that foreign exchange markets are emotional entities as well as calculating entities. And, you know, you think back to Liz Truss in Britain. Everybody has held that little 2-week or whatever it was experiment as a demonstration that fiscal policy can't go against what the foreign exchange markets want. Well, I didn't see it like that at all. I saw it as a government that, and a prime minister and chancellor that nobody trusted to hold their word. Because if the financial markets were all powerful, well, then the Japanese yen should be broke, because they've been getting short sellers for months, trying to force the Bank of England to push up interest rates. The Bank of Japan to push up interest rates, and the short sellers keep losing money. And the reason they keep losing money is because the Bank of Japan and the Ministry of Finance and the Cabinet Office are very secure in their positions. And whereas the British government was like a rabble, and everybody knew it was a rabble, and they didn't know which day it was half the time. And so the financial markets understood that weakness in the political system and bet against them, and the British government bowed to the pressure in a way that the Japanese government will never bow. So it's a lot of these foreign exchange dynamics are linked to the stability of the governance and sophistication of the governance and the security of the politics. And a political situation that's unstable, like Turkey, is a target for betting against. Now, Turkey surprisingly has become more stable politically, and and that's not a good thing in their context, but that's the reality.
Yeah. So I guess to bring this to a close, let's talk, I guess, about what history can teach us about policy going forward. Given what we talked about, what should be the response to A, demand side inflation, and B, cost push inflation? And especially in the modern context, because in the 70s we had the wage price dynamics because trade unions were pretty strong. And nowadays we don't really have that. So inflation, I guess, isn't even, well, probably wouldn't be sustained. So how should the government react? How should it have reacted back in the 70s to the inflation? And how should it react right now to the current crisis?
Well, in the 1970s, it was a problem over the distribution of income. The nations had to take a real income loss. They did take a real income loss. And the question then was, well, who was going to take it? And ultimately, the governments decided that it was the workers who were going to take it through unemployment. The way I would have handled it would have been to be more aggressive in mediating the class conflict. Effectively, what governments did at that point was to shift from being a mediator to an agent of capital. And
Barbara Castle proposed, in place of strife, a set of rules to put on unions in regards to how to mediate demands. Do you think that was the approach to take?
I think you had to have social contracts with unions, but the problem was that governments tried that, but they didn't try to have social contracts with business.
Right.
And that was the missing link. I mean, in Australia, we introduced a wage indexation system, but in 1974, the government in Australia tried to bring in a tripartite agreement with business unions and government, and that failed because business wouldn't cooperate. So I would have been more aggressive in my regulation of business at that time.
Right.
Right now, the problem's not that problem at all, because the workers are now effectively powerless, with exceptions. But you've now, it's quite clear now, even though there's a denial by central bankers and politicians, it's quite obvious now that you're getting what was just a temporary supply side inflation coming from the sickness of COVID and the disruption to food from Ukraine, etc., and oil prices. Those factors are abating now, as they always were going to, but the inflation is persisting a little bit. It's dropping, but it's persistent because of profit gouging. And it's no doubt that corporations have taken advantage of this situation to try to push up their profit margins. Well, I would just, governments could take care of that relatively quickly and just tax it all away and have punitive rules on corporations doing that. Not agree. So in a lot of the privatised contracts in our nations now, there's annual agreements on how much energy prices or railway fares can go up. Well, the government can, they're administrative prices, the government can manipulate them. In Australia, for example, we're one of the largest producers of liquid gas, and we produce vast amounts more than the domestic requirements, but we've currently got a domestic shortage of gas. How come? And a massive escalation in the price of gas for households. How come? Well, it's because the 4 big multinational companies own the gas licenses, and they've diverted all the supply into Europe as a consequence of the shortage of gas as a consequence of the Ukraine situation. Now, the Australian government could just terminate their licenses, bang, that's it. But they refuse to. How can you have a domestic shortage of gas and a high inflation rate of gas when you produce more than the domestic requirements? And so they're the sort of, I think effectively now we've had 30 odd years of neoliberalism, and the balance of power has shifted firmly towards capital again. And the only way back is to retrench that, as we did during the post-war period. We've got to go back to that sort of retrenchment and belief in society and belief in the capacity of government to act on our behalf as our agent. Now, until we are in a position where we can force that, not much is going to change and improve. And my big concern is that the dynamics, there was a reason why trade unions formed in the late 19th century. There was a reason why governments introduced welfare states, because there was a risk of insurrection from the people. Because the problem now is we're heading towards that, but I don't think society can change quickly enough to outpace the climate changes. And so I think all human history, we're going to be led to a major change through crisis, not through a well-managed human intervention.
So I guess that ties very neatly into my last question, which is, what is your advice for us? So we're a student society of wellbeing economics at Sussex, and we're trying to get the curriculum changed. Just a couple of weeks ago, I managed to have a conversation with Nicholas Krauss. He's the president of the Royal Economic Society, national body here in the UK, and he's also a professor in British economic history here at Sussex. And when I had dialogue with him about changing the curriculum, he didn't actually dispute any of my points about endogenous money or the cost plus markup approach or why marginal productivity theory is wrong. He disputed nothing. What he said was, don't worry about that. That's just theory. What we deal with is econometrics and statistics. What do you say? How should we respond to that kind of response?
Well, I just wouldn't respond to it. It's ridiculous. And I mean, the basis of policy comes from the academy. And it works with a lag, but that's the reality. And as senior professor, I'm a senior professor, but I'm outnumbered by 50 to 1 by new Keynesian professors. Now, they deal in non-knowledge as far they deal in fiction. So the only way we're going to get a change is when they disappear from the academy, or there's a student revolt and you start promoting alternative ideas, and you're relatively powerless to do that, and that's the problem. And I'm old enough to have seen a paradigm shift in economics, unfortunately, on both counts, the shift and the age. But we'll have another paradigm shift at some point. But degenerative paradigms hang on for years, and that's common in all academic disciplines. It can take 30 or 40 years to get rid of a defunct paradigm. It's not a very hopeful thing. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
So
I mean, what can we do?
I hope I've given you some useful information anyway.
Oh, definitely. It's been a real pleasure having you on. I really appreciate you coming on. So thank you dearly.
No worries. Okay, see you later.
See ya.